So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending this evening's program, Landscapes of Hope, Nature and the Great Migration in Chicago with Brian McCammack. This program is very important to us here at the History Center as it continues on our African American programming series named Deeply Rooted and Rising High. Came out of a very generous grant that we were awarded from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Historical Association back in March of 2022. And so through that grant, we were able to put on a number of different programming opportunities with us and in collaboration with the Ragdale Foundation. And so Professor McCammack, who is joining us here tonight as our guest speaker, will be talking about his new publication. So before we get into the program, I have a couple notes that I want to remind everyone of in case you haven't been to a Zoom lecture recently. If you go to the top right corner of your screen, there's a selection that you can make at the view bar. If you go ahead and press that button and press speaker, that will automatically change your camera perspective to whoever is speaking. So it might make it a little bit easier for you to watch the program tonight. We also ask that all attendees please keep their microphones muted for the duration of the program. The program will run for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have a final 15 minutes devoted to questions and answers. And at that point, you can write a question in the chat function of your screen down at the bottom, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question, and I'll be monitoring the chat if anyone types a question for Professor McCammack at the end of this presentation. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Brian McCammack is an award-winning author and current professor of environmental studies at Lake Forest College. He has previously taught at multiple universities, including Harvard University, Tufts University, and Williams College, and has published and continues to publish dozens of articles on Chicago's environmental history. Professor McCammack is currently working on a book about the origins of the environmental justice movement and currently teaches multiple college courses focused on the connections between history, literature, and environmentalism. And Brian McCammack's book is also available on Harvard University Press, which I've included a link to in the chat function here, along with links to 2 local environmental organizations that we are sponsoring for this program. So if you're interested in getting involved with local environmental organizations, we have a link to the Clean Power Lake County website and the Sweetwater Foundation website. And then before we get started here, this program was also very generously co-sponsored by Lake Forest Open Lands, and I've included their information in the chat function below. So with that, I'd like to pass the stage on to our guest speaker for tonight, Professor McCammack.
Thanks for that nice introduction, George. I appreciate that. And I know you said that everybody should stay muted, and I think it would be nice to stay muted if you've got a TV on in the background or something. But since we're such a small group, I'm happy to entertain questions in the midst of my talk, treat it more like a seminar, a small class, rather than me just talking at you for 45 or 50 minutes and then holding questions to the end. So if I say something that jogs a question for you, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom and start more of a conversation rather than a one-way talk at you. So most of my talk today is drawn from the last chapter of the book that George mentioned, Landscapes of Hope. It's really concerns primarily the Skokie Lagoons and the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, the way African Americans helped construct the Skokie Lagoons just south of Lake Forest. But I want to talk a little bit more about the bigger ideas of the book so you can think about maybe how that case study or that one chapter fits into the bigger argument. And I think it's easiest to start doing that by unpacking that title, Landscapes of Hope. I'm terrible with coming up with titles. This was like right before the book went to press. I was like, oh, this should be the title of the book. And in part because it's a play on what I think is still probably the definitive history of the African-American Great Migration, Jim Grossman's Land of Hope, published by University of Chicago Press, I think 1989, so like 35-ish years old now. And that title, Jim Grossman's title, Land of Hope, was Grossman picking up on how African-American migrants themselves saw Chicago. especially oftentimes before they even got to Chicago. And that's in comparison to the South, right? If we're talking about the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, you've got the American South of Jim Crow, disfranchisement, racial violence. And so in many ways, I think Landscapes of Hope is putting an environmental valence on Chicago itself being the land of hope, a destination where African Americans could escape that kind of privation and that kind of racial violence they were facing in the South and make a life for themselves and their families. And scholars, historians and social scientists, humanists, had written volumes and volumes and volumes on Chicago and the Great Migration in particular, but often that concerned the way African Americans factored into labor and business, religion, education, pop culture. There wasn't a whole lot, if anything, written about the environment. So that's really the project of Landscapes of Hope, and I can share my screen here. I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint, and I promise I'm not going to bore you with PowerPointy stuff. But one of the things of the book that I'm most proud of is the visual record, the photographic record that I was able to unearth in the archive. So I'm going to show you a lot of photographs of African Americans experiencing the environment and shaping the environment. So how did African Americans think about the environment in the early 20th century? And we're painting with very, very broad strokes here, right? I mean, you talk to one Black Chicagoan, they would give you a completely different story than another Black Chicagoan, than another Black Chicagoan. But as historians, we have to sort of generalize. And the way that the environment was typically thought of, if we put African Americans in conversation with the environment in Chicago, Richard Wright looms so large over the story of African American migration in Chicago. And this is what he says in the introduction to Black Metropolis, which is probably the definitive sociological study of African American life in the early 20th century in Chicago. Co-edited by Sinclair Drake and Horace Caton, University of Chicago sociologists. Richard Wright was remembering himself as a migrant, that he came to Chicago from Mississippi, and there in that great iron city, that impersonal, mechanical city, amid the steam, the smoke, the snowy winds, the blistering suns, there in that self-conscious city, that city so deadly dramatic and stimulating, we caught whispers of the meanings that life could have, and we were pushed and pounded by facts much too big for us. There's not a lot of room for agency. There's not a lot of room for African Americans creating opportunity, right? This is not the land of hope right here in Richard Wright's version of Chicago. This is the land of hopes being dashed, right, by racism and other barriers that migrants faced in Chicago that were much the same as what they faced in the South. There's not a lot of hope there, right? And I think that lack of hope in a city that just grinds you down has been the foundation of a lot of environmental justice lately. So I was talking about environmental justice scholarship and the way that Richard Wright has sort of loomed large over the way folks think about the environment in Chicago and African American life in Chicago. And I gave you that quote from Black Metropolis. And in a book called 12 Million Black Voices, Richard Wright used a lot of photographs from Chicago in the 1930s and 1940s. And these are the kinds of environments that you see in that book. This is a section of the book called Death on the City Pavements, which gives you a pretty good idea of how Richard Wright thought about the city's influence on African Americans. And there are children playing in rubble in alleyways, right? Vacant lots. We've got heavy industry looming over everything. It's an environment that's decaying. But early on in the research for this book, right, this is the dominant narrative of the environment in Chicago. In the same book where Richard Wright wrote the introduction in Black Metropolis, Sinclair Drake and Horace Caton also say, quote, "To Washington Park in the summer, Bronzeville's teeming thousands swarm, lounging on the grass, frolicking in the Black Belt's one large swimming pool, fishing and rowing in the lagoon, playing softball, tennis, or baseball. Here, too, is Bronzeville's equivalent of Hyde Park, where jackleg preachers joust with curbstone atheists and Black Zionists break a lance with sundry varieties of reds." that sounded like a culturally vibrant environmental space, right? Washington Park, 371 acres on the south side, but this kind of description is buried on page 603 of, like an 850-page book about African Americans in the early 20th century in Chicago. So in that passage, we see a glimmer, right, of the land of hope realized for Black migrants. And those 371 acres of nature in Washington Park are absolutely integral to that story. So for those of you who don't know, we're not too familiar with the south side of Chicago. Washington Park is right here, sort of at the southern edge of what was known then as the Black Belt. The Black Belt keeps creeping south and east and west. The University of Chicago is sort of an island here of racial diversity, much like it is today. That was pretty much, it was almost exclusively white a century ago. But you see Washington Park, right, is right next door to a lot of these predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And this is what it looks like from the air, right? You see the extent of it, like these are all baseball diamonds cut out of the meadow of this park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux in 1871. You've got a lagoon on the southern portion. This is a swimming pool drained in the winter that Drake and Caton were talking about. But I'm going to show you some more photographs of African Americans experiencing that space. This is one of my favorite photographs that I found in my research. Two young boys, I would guess 3, 4, 5. My daughter's 5. They look about her age. You would never guess that you were in the middle of Chicago in this photograph, right? So to see African Americans experiencing nature, constructed though it may be, right? And it certainly was constructed by, according to Olmsted and Vaux's design, this kind of scene doesn't really factor into African American history. So the book is really meant to fill in that gap and try to understand how and why nature was important to African Americans in this period. Here you have a couple walking on the very broad meadow here. Again, like in a photograph like this, you can't see any buildings, right? I mean, you wouldn't know that you were in the middle of Chicago. This is the first summer that the pool was open on the west side of Washington Park. I love just seeing all the kids sort of mugging for the camera in front here. But it was, again, a culturally vibrant space, right? And many of you may know that the Washington Park hosts the annual Bud Billiken Day Picnic, which is the culmination of the parade and picnic, sort of a back to school tradition that's been going on for African Americans in Chicago for almost a century now. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit from that and say, and give you sort of an overview of the Great Migration, if you're not familiar with sort of the basic contours of the Great Migration, and really just how profoundly it changed northern and western cities like Chicago, like New York, like Cleveland, Detroit. In the first wave of migration between World Wars I and II, more or less, you got about 1.5 to 2 million African Americans leaving the South for places like Chicago. Chicago's African American population about sextuples in that period, from 44,000 to more than 250,000. And it's really hard to overstate just how Southern in character African Americans in the city were in this period. Roughly 3/4 of Black Chicagoans were Southern born, mostly from Mississippi, Alabama, or Tennessee. If you were an African American in Chicago in the 1930s, 1940s, you were as likely to have been born in Mississippi as you were anywhere in the North, right? That's just how Southern in character Chicago was in this period. So the book, again, is aiming to go beyond environmental justice and uncover environmental culture in Chicago, not just the city, but also the rural Midwest, collapsing boundaries between urban and rural, and discovering that African Americans, many of them were a lot more mobile than was previously assumed, and were actually seeking out nature in more rural locales. One of those was Idlewild, still a predominantly African American resort in Michigan, but a huge destination for a lot of the wealthy African American class in the 1920s and 1930s. Even the middle classes of African Americans in Chicago, many of them were able to send their children to YMCA camp. This Camp Wabash in Southwest Michigan and Dowagiac was actually the first segregated African-American YMCA camp that was owned wholly by African Americans. So a real point of pride in the community. See kids presumably getting swimming lessons here around 1930, mucking around in the lake there. And another part of this visual record that you get in the archives, especially in a scene like this, is just how similar a lot of this work that they're doing in this truck garden, in this vegetable and fruit garden in Michigan, harvesting vegetables that would actually then go back to Chicago, go back to the YMCA in Chicago on the South Side. How similar a photograph like that looks to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, right? But this is not Alabama, this is Michigan. So the book is really trying to wrestle with all these questions of, images like this in part that really challenge conventional and dominant narratives about African Americans and nature. Now, I want to go a little bit deeper in that last chapter that I mentioned at the outset about the Skokie Lagoons. Most of you probably know where the Skokie Lagoons are. If you're going up the Edens Expressway from the city, up the North Shore, look to your right, and there they are, right? When you start losing all the strip malls and businesses and houses at the edge of the Edens, and you've got all of a sudden a lot of trees and grass and stuff, that's the Skokie Lagoons. So all of that was unusable marshland back in the 1920s. And it wasn't until the Civilian Conservation Corps transformed that land that really allowed much of the North Shore to be developed, right? Regulating flooding, dealing with a whole host of issues that limited development in what it was pretty marshy land. So there's Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, all the way up there, Washington Park that I was talking about before, way down there on the south side of Chicago. The rest of the talk today, I'm going to talk about the Skokie Lagoons here, which were constructed before the Edens Expressway went in there. Quick overview of the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was one of FDR's first New Deal relief programs, established in 1933, didn't end until 1942. Of course, the US enters World War II in December of 1941. All of the young men, 18 to 23, later 17 to 28, who had been working on projects in the Civilian Conservation Corps, you don't need those guys working in the Skokie Lagoons anymore. You need them overseas in the European theater and the Pacific theater fighting World War II. So the Civilian Conservation Corps really only ends because of World War II. The CCC paid these young men $1 a day. They only get to keep $5 of that a month. $25 is sent back to their families, right? To support brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers who were put out of work by the Depression. So one of the things that I really emphasize in this chapter is that the work that you're about to see, these African-American young men, 18 to 23, maybe older teenagers doing in the Skokie Lagoons, that's not just transforming the landscape at the lagoons themselves. That money is going back to support African Americans who, in the African American community at the peak of the Depression, the peak of the bad point of the Depression in 1933-34, African American unemployment was approaching 50% in Chicago, right? People freak out if unemployment approaches like 10% or the high single digits now. 50% of working age and women unemployed at this point. So the work that these young guys are doing in Skokie is making a tangible difference on the south side of Chicago, not just on the North Shore. Why environmental labor? Why was this a solution to the privation of the Depression? FDR thought that the purpose of this work was both to build men, build their strength, build their character, and to build trees. And it builds on earlier ideas about nature that date back to Teddy Roosevelt and even earlier about rugged masculinity in nature. But manual labor was really emphasized in the Civilian Conservation Corps. There was training for sure on machines and using a variety of tools, but manual labor was emphasized. And the goal was to improve land. This is a pretty outdated way of understanding. If there's anybody here from open lands, right, you know about this, but the idea that you can improve land was sort of a conservation ideal that we have moved past since the 1930s. But the sense was that you could really improve land for human benefit, land that had been depleted or ignored or abused. So it's a synthesis of progressive era ideas about environmental management and the benefits of being in a rural or wilderness type environment. And it was supposed to have a tangible change on the enrollees themselves, right? You see this new enrollee coming to Camp Alito, which was downstate Illinois, all dressed up in almost like a zoot suit kind of outfit here. He's supposed to be transformed into this quasi-military looking guy. And the idea was that you get trained, that you get strong in the CCC, you get fed 3 square meals a day in order to go back to the city at the end of your 6-month or year-long tour of duty, and you're ready to re-enter the workforce, right? The idea was never that you're going to stay at the CCC more than 6 months or a year. The hope was that you would be trained in order to take up industrial jobs again in the city. Now, the Skokie Lagoons is a case study. Nationwide, African Americans, 250,000 African Americans in that age range that I talked about earlier, served in the CCC nationwide. In Illinois, we got about 15,000 to 20,000. According to my calculations, it's about 25 to 30% of all eligible men. I mean, that's a pretty high number, and I think higher than a lot of people had assumed. The Skokie Lagoons is the largest project in Illinois, and that's part of the reason that I write so much about it in the last chapter. Secretary of the Interior at the time was Harold Ickes, a North Shore resident, sort of bringing some pork home in order to juice the local economy. At the Skokie Lagoons, 20% of workers on the project were African American. You had a few hundred on site at a time. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of the Lagoon and Channel Network was both flood control and creating a recreational space. So here's some images from early on in the construction of the Skokie Lagoons. This is actually one of my favorite images from the archives at the University of Illinois, Chicago. You've got an aerial photograph looking north. They started digging the lagoons at the south end of the lagoons at Willow Road, sort of dug their way up all the way up to Dundee Road, which is just south of what is now the Chicago Botanic Gardens. So in this photograph, you can see the development right along the lakeshore. This is Lake Michigan in the upper right portion of the frame here. The development really stops right before you get too far inland, and that's because that was all marshy land that would regularly flood. Farmland wasn't even of much value there. So the whole purpose of the Skokie Lagoons was to create this lagoon and channel network to drain all of that flooding, keep it contained in one space so that you can further develop all of this land adjacent to the Skokie Lagoons, right? And I just think this is a really vivid visual representation of how that transforms the landscape, right? If you think about, they're about, what, a third of the way done, a quarter of the way done at this point in 1934. And they continue to transform this landscape further north. So what did this labor look like? For African American enrollees, it really was manual labor. And again in the archives, you see African American enrollees, you see commanding officers talking about how the labor that African Americans got was the dirtiest, was the most, terrible kind of labor, whereas white enrollees tended to get easier labor that trained them on machines, that trained them on the kinds of equipment that would make them more employable. Meanwhile, African Americans are working with wheelbarrows and shovels. Now, if we go back to this slide, all of these little channels that are connecting the larger lagoons, those are dug out by hand, right? So the next time you're at the Skokie Lagoons and you look at these little channels, and there are channels that are very thin channels that border the entire Skokie Lagoons, so you can kind of see out here on the edges, those were dug out by hand. That is the work that African Americans were predominantly doing. The larger lagoons, which you can go canoeing on or kayaking, you know, you can, I think the kayak rental is at Tower Road maybe. Those were dug out with machines, right? That's the kind of labor that predominantly white enrollees were doing. And this is, you know, again, one of the reasons that I love the visual record here is that you see just how young these guys are. I mean, this kid looks like he could be 14 to me in the foreground here, but really transformed the landscape of the North Shore. Again, you see just how young a lot of them were, some of them mugging for the camera here. And working through all seasons, draining areas, digging out these areas, weeding areas. You see weeds taller than these guys who are probably 6 feet tall. All of this kind of environmental labor, again, is very reminiscent to me of the kind of environmental labor that many African-American migrants or their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation really sought to escape in the South. So this last chapter is really examining you know, what it means for a generation of young African-American men to return to labor on the land when the migration in Great Migration in large part was sort of a repudiation of that kind of labor on the land. And it was intense labor. I mean, it was year round. They only shut down work if it got like below -10 degrees, if it got over 100 degrees. So you've got guys working, you know, in February, working in ankle deep mud. You know, this is Illinois, Chicagoland year round. And African Americans are pulling wheelbarrows of mud to dig out the Skokie Lagoons. So a lot of them are writing poetry, writing news articles for publications that were published by the Civilian Conservation Corps companies that were really, you know, optimistic about the kind of work that they're doing, finding virtue in connecting to nature. But a lot of it is just pure drudgery. So one of the things this chapter is trying to do is, again, contrast what's going on at the Skokie Lagoons in the 1930s with the landscapes that African-American migrants have left behind in the South. Now, at exactly the same time that this work is going on in Skokie in the mid-1930s, David L. Cohn, a white writer, writing about African-Americans in the Mississippi Delta, where a lot of Black Chicagoans began their lives, or their parents began their lives in the Mississippi Delta. David Cohn wrote, quote, "The land is first and last his, i.e. African-Americans' handiwork. It was he who brought order out of a primeval wilderness, felling the trees, digging the ditches, and draining the swamp. Wherever one looks in this land, whatever one sees that is the work of man was erected by the toiling, straining bodies of blacks." The irony here is that wherever you look in the North Shore of Chicago in the Skokie Lagoons, you could say the same thing, right? And I don't think very many people realize that. Digging the ditches, draining the swamps, that is exactly what African Americans were doing in Skokie. If you go downstate, African Americans were crushing limestone, were fixing drainage tile on agricultural land in order for agricultural yields to be boosted, right? Land that had been abused over the course of generations. African American companies in downstate Illinois, across the rural Midwest, are doing the kind of work to bring nature back really from the brink of destruction. I write a lot also in this chapter about African Americans in northern Michigan. Northern Michigan was essentially cut over. All of that first growth forest, by the time you get to the 1930s, has been gone for a generation, maybe 2 generations. All of that lumber, much of it being shipped through Chicago. This is the theme of one key chapter in William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis about Chicago's environmental history. That lumber coming through Chicago, being processed and being sent out to the plains in order for homes and other things to be built on the plains where there's just not enough lumber to go around. You get to the 1930s, African Americans are replanting those trees in northern Michigan. in order not just to bring back nature, not just in order to bring back another source of timber, right, a generation hence, but also to create recreational areas, right? So much like the kind of work that they're doing in the Skokie Lagoons in the 1930s. Another key theme of the book is that the Great Migration, which I think in many ways can be viewed as a repudiation of the kind of racial logic of Booker T. Washington, accommodationism to white racism, white supremacy, racial violence in the South, in order for African Americans to hopefully better themselves economically. Another thing Booker T. Washington advocated was that African Americans, he said in 1904, said that our pathway must be up through the soil, up through the swamps, up through forests, up through the streams and rocks. It's like a pull yourself up by your bootstraps, take dignity in manual labor. You know, that kind of logic was largely repudiated by the Great Migration when African Americans are laying down their agricultural tools in the South in order for them to move to places like Chicago and take up jobs in industry, like the steel mills and the stockyards, in commerce in major metropolitan areas like Detroit and Chicago. So the migration's a repudiation of that, but then we have a generation later, right, thousands of African Americans going back and doing the kind of manual environmental labor that Booker T. Washington advocated. Right. So what do we do with that in terms of how that reflects on the Great Migration and its successes or failures? Right. The migrants, have they achieved what they hope to achieve or not? What does it mean for a hypothetical migrant who has left behind agricultural labor in the South 20 years ago, has children in Chicago, has a family, and now this family's son is going to work in the Skokie Lagoons and doing the kind of work that his parents left behind 20 years ago? What does that mean, right, in terms of African-American progress? The Civilian Conservation Corps story also sort of contradicts or challenges Richard Wright's ideas that, you know, with migration, no longer do African-American lives depend upon the soil, the sun, the rain, or the wind. We live by the grace of jobs and brutal logic of jobs. Civilian Conservation Corps is kind of an interesting combination of industrial logic, the industrial world that Richard Wright is talking about here, but also a throwback to the sort of pre-industrial, more agricultural-based world of the South that many migrants left behind. So what I end up arguing in this last chapter, dealing with all of these big themes, is that the CCC effectively blended that long history of rural environmental labor in the South with the logic of modern industrial progress in the North. And one thing that I haven't dwelled on here, and I can go deeper into this in Q&A, is that virtually all CCC enrollees, regardless of race, performed manual environmental labor, but companies were segregated racially. After a very early period in 1933, experimenting with integrated companies, it becomes federal policy for the Civilian Conservation Corps to racially segregate companies. And for African Americans, what I argue, the valence, the meaning of that work on the land was much different than it was for white enrollees. Their shared cultural history of slavery, sharecropping, and the Great Migration made that Civilian Conservation Corps experience unique. One of the ways that I elaborate on that in the chapter is that a downstate Illinois company, African-American company, and these African-American companies, by the way, were almost always being commanded by white officers, right? They're segregated companies where you have white officials in charge of African-American enrollees. And this is really, I think, powerfully visually represented by this photograph from Skokie in August of 1933. You've got African-American enrollees digging out these ditches by hand, some of them ankle deep in the ditch filled with water. And then this rather portly white gentleman up here at the top, right, hands on hips, looking over what again could essentially look like a chain gang in the South, what could look like forced environmental labor in the South. I mean, it has a plantation feel about it, photographs like this. So in this downstate company that I was talking about, you have enrollees complaining about their white commanding officers being racially abusive to them, clearly racist behavior and treatment they're facing. And they say in their letters, their pleas to federal officials, that they feel like the Civilian Conservation Corps camp downstate Illinois has all the marks of a peonage farm in the Southland, right? That it feels like they might as well be in the American South. So one other thing that I want to talk about before I wrap things up for Q&A in the next couple minutes is that I don't just write about the African-American experience in the 1930s. I also think through what sort of the lasting impact of this environmental labor was on the land, a generation after the 1930s, 2 generations after, 3 generations after. And one of the reasons I do this is because I think it helps students connect to why something in the 1930s matters today. So that was the 1930s. A skeptical student might ask, how does that actually matter to me today, right? If I care about something like the Black Lives Matter movement, if I care about the kind of work that the Sweetwater Foundation does on the south side of Chicago, which George posted that link to the kind of work that they do. How does a story about something that happened almost a century ago now, how is that even relevant? Well, we all probably know that Chicagoland is incredibly racially segregated, right? By some metrics, the most segregated city in the country. This is old census data, but it's still a better dot map than what they've come up with from the 2020 census data. And honestly, it hasn't changed all that much. And you can see here just how racially segregated Chicago is. The South Side, this is the historic Black Belt. If we go back to that map that I showed at the very beginning, has only expanded further south, further west to the Lake Shore and South Shore area. We've also got, with the second wave of the Great Migration after World War II, the West Side African-American population growing by leaps and bounds. And then you have Latinx Chicagoans on the southwest side, Pilsen Little Village, on the northwest side. And the north side of Chicago is predominantly white, Evanston a little bit more diverse, but by the time you get up to the North Shore, right, I mean, you may live in Lake Forest or Lake Bluff, it's pretty white, right? This little dark dot here, incidentally, is the density of Lake Forest College. This is always something that I think it's funny to point out. You can see just how sparsely populated the suburbs are, the North Shore and the western suburbs, as compared to the city itself, too. Not just, being sort of racially homogeneous for the most part, but also much less densely populated, right, as the colors get lighter up here. All right, so how does this matter today? That the Skokie Lagoons were constructed right here about a century ago. You notice, again, that it's surrounded by a predominantly white population, right, in the immediate proximity of the Skokie Lagoons. Chicago Botanic Gardens right up here, a little bit further north. Remember that the purpose of the Skokie Lagoons in the 1930s was flood control and to create a recreational space, right? Well, as I said, flood control, I mean, that's largely worked, right? And it's created development opportunity over the past, 80 years or so on the North Shore. And it really did so immediately after the Skokie Lagoons were completed in the late 1930s. So the post-World War II economic boom, man, the Skokie Lagoons, the fact that they made this land usable for residences, for businesses, that really drove the economic engine, helped drive. I don't want to make it seem had a bigger effect than it actually did, but it really did help and enable this land to develop. Well, that economic development on the North Shore that was enabled in large part and in part 20%, right, of the enrollees in Skokie were African American. African American labor was creating the context for economic development that accrued almost exclusively to white Chicagoans on the North Shore, right? You could say the same about downstate Illinois, right? If they are fixing drainage tile that is broken down, which they did again and again, if they are creating drainage ditches, if they are crushing limestone to fix the pH of the soil and increase agricultural yields downstate, by and large, those benefits are accruing to white Illinoisans. Is that how you say that? Illinoisans? I don't know. White Illini, Illinois residents. And the African-American enrollees who are planting forests in northern Michigan, right, as a recreational spot and an economic driver for northern Michigan tourism. Those benefits are accruing primarily to white Michiganders, right? So the environmental labor that African-Americans performed in the 1930s, yes, they're getting paid the same dollar a day that white enrollees are. But as the effects of that labor are felt through the generations following that labor, those benefits are accruing disproportionately to white Americans rather than African Americans. And in terms of it, the Skokie Lagoons in particular being a recreational spot, right? African Americans from the west side of Chicago, from the south side of Chicago, are not going to go all the way up to the Skokie Lagoons, by and large, right? We're painting with broad strokes here, to go kayaking or canoeing and use that as a recreational spot, to go jogging around the Skokie Lagoons. The people who are using that primarily are the predominantly white folks on the North Shore, right? So again, that it's not just the development potential, it's the recreational potential of the Skokie Lagoons. The environment that looks like this today, right? Those kinds of benefits are disproportionately accruing to white Chicagoans. All right, I hope folks have questions. We can have a little bit of a conversation. That is all I've got for you for now, at least, but I'm happy to entertain questions.
Yep, so feel free to unmute yourselves or type anything in the chat. Brian, I have a question, actually, just looking through
That's right, George. You got to do the thing that professors do when
professors do. Exactly right. Yeah, to kind of get a conversation rolling here. But no, it was incredibly fascinating. And I think one of the most interesting aspects to me was that you can see the parallel lives that people, just as you mentioned, in the Mississippi Delta and in the Skokie Lagoons were witnessing firsthand. And you know, when you look at the oscillating history of African-American labor, you know, where you start off with slavery, move into Reconstruction, then you have Jim Crow, and then you have the Great Migrations where, you know, work seems to be kind of a little bit more better in that. I don't want to use better as a blanket term, but did you ever in your research find examples of firsthand testimonials, African-Americans working in areas such as the Skokie Lagoons, that they felt the work was justified or that it was honest work compared to, you know, what they were experiencing in the South? Did they ever mention that, you know, well, this work it's manual labor, it's tough, but it's for a good cause? Was that ever anything that you encountered?
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't mean to paint the labor as solely just like a punishing kind of daily grind and you know, devoid of any sort of reward. I mentioned in passing the newspapers that were produced by pretty much each company in the Civilian Conservation Corps, with articles written by enrollees themselves, edited by enrollees. In many of those articles, whether you're and I tended to focus on the Midwest because mainly Black Chicagoans, like if your home address was in Chicago, you worked in Illinois or Michigan, sometimes you went up to Wisconsin, but you stayed within the region. So I was looking at enrollees in a lot of those sort of adjoining states as well. A lot of them have really rewarding stories about being in nature and how that is so different and sort of emotionally rewarding than their lives had been on the south side of Chicago or on the west side. The one caveat with that, and you always have to be aware of this as a historian and sort of read against the grain and ask yourself, what might not be said, what might be said for a certain purpose, right? The white commanding officers were surely always reading these newspapers, right? So you can't necessarily take the newspapers and enrollees saying, all of these great things about their experience in nature at face value. You have to also understand that they have bosses, they have people who may have been, racially discriminating against them, sort of looking over their shoulders and looking at what they're saying. And they might be saying things in order to, say what the white commanding officer wants to hear or say what the higher ups want to hear. But I think when you put the Civilian Conservation Corps, the experience of African-American enrollees in conversation with all of the other stuff that I found in the course of my research in the archives about African-American experiences in the forest preserves surrounding Chicago, going there for leisure, right? Not necessarily labor. Their experiences in Washington Park, their experiences in Idlewild and other rural resorts. You put all of that together, and there is a lot more evidence there in support of African Americans forging a really productive relationship with nature that really hadn't been seen in the history, I think, until my book. That sounds a little pompous, but I see a question in the chat about Hispanics or other races participating in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Yes, definitely. There were no, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about this, there were no specific racial quotas for other racial groups aside from African Americans. The Civilian Conservation Corps nationally set a quota of 10% of the Civilian Conservation Corps being African American. So what that actually effectively leads to in northern states like Illinois is African American overrepresentation in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Because even though the Great Migration had resulted by the 1940s in a sextupling of Chicago's Black population, statewide, states like Illinois, Wisconsin, the African American population was still below 10%. And even in Chicago, by that period, it was still below 10%. When you look at the South, on the other hand, states like Mississippi and Alabama, their African American population, in some cases, well over 50%, or at least approaching 50%. So if you set a 10% quota, you have a dramatic underrepresentation of African Americans. And Civilian Conservation Corps companies were always administered locally or regionally, right? It's a federal program, but the folks who are in charge of CCC, enrollees in Illinois, by and large, are from Illinois. So Illinois and even Chicago in this period did have, at least a small Latinx population. A scholar by the name of, type his name in the chat, Michael Innes Jimenez, has written a book, I believe, I'm doubting myself now, it's called Steel Barrio, about the Latinx migration to Chicago in the early to mid 20th century. But that population, compared to the African-American population, was like a drop in the bucket. So I did not uncover anything about Latinx work in the Skokie Lagoons, but I do know that Latinx CCC work in the Southwest, for instance, and in the Mountain West was much more significant than it was in the Midwest. This question about the Youth Conservation Corps part of the CCC. No, not technically part of the CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps did end in 1942. And periodically, in the sort of the dawn of the modern environmental movement, for instance, in the 1960s and early 1970s, you have people sort of trying to bring back a new version of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Youth Conservation Corps is certainly indebted to the ideals of the Civilian Conservation Corps, but to my knowledge, the CCC was the first federal program that really worked to, conserve, for lack of a better word, land across the country. And all of the subsequent programs that might use that term Conservation Corps are not directly related, but they're certainly like intellectually and conceptually descended from the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Brian, could you give us any insight as to what current work you're doing in terms of environmental justice? I know you mentioned that at the beginning of this program, but for a taste of what's to come, is there anything that you could give us on the nature of your current research?
Yeah, my current research project is a little bit more ambitious, not limited to Chicago or one racial group, but it really is still about the intersection of race and the environment. And I'm fast forwarding to the post-World War II era and thinking about how the modern environmental movement that really sprung up in the late 1960s, first Earth Day in 1970, and maturing with a bunch of major national legislation over the course of the 1970s, how that movement stayed predominantly white and middle class, despite the fact that a lot of folks who were involved at the very beginnings of the movement, Gaylord Nelson, for instance, the Wisconsin senator who's credited with beginning Earth Day in 1970, they and many others, leaders from the top, senators like that, to the grassroots, were saying that the environmental movement needed to be racially diverse. It needed to be concerned not just with wilderness spaces and the kind of traditional concerns of organizations like the Sierra Club, but it also needed to be concerned with urban areas, the kinds of places like the South Side of Chicago, right, that were predominantly and still are today, African-American at that point, and needed to be as concerned with wilderness space as it was with urban areas and issues like lead poisoning, both from paint and from leaded gasoline, with rats and solid waste and the kinds of issues that mattered to communities of color at that period. How did those, alliances ultimately fail, even though there were a lot more attempts than I think people generally remember there being in the 1970s? And how did that help lead to the emergence of the grassroots environmental justice movement in the 1980s and 1990s? Let me answer this one question about the age of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Were there classes like math, reading, or writing for articles and company papers? Yes, there were classes, and not just training on industrial type equipment and machines, but classes in math, in reading. There were little libraries at the Civilian Conservation Corps. But one of the things that you see again and again is that African Americans enrollees are claiming that they are not afforded the same kinds of opportunities as white enrollees, because you've got segregated companies, so you've got segregated sets of opportunities. And that goes for, sports leagues, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps. You think about a bunch of young guys, right? Teenagers and early 20-somethings. At this point in history, boxing, baseball, starting to get into basketball a little bit, but these kinds of sports were huge. And that was a way for enrollees to forge community in what was, essentially a barracks, quasi-military type situation, where you weren't too far from home all the time, right? If you were an African-American, the Skokie Lagoons, you weren't too far from the South Side or the West Side, where you and your family likely lived. But you only got to go there on the weekends, sometimes maybe once a month. So those sports teams and other opportunities for advancement intellectually and in terms of your skill set, those were disproportionately given to white enrollees, but they did exist across segregated companies. And the healthcare question, as far as I'm aware, healthcare was pretty good. I mean, you're talking about, especially in the early to mid 1930s, a lot of these young men were going hungry, right? So just to be able to be in the Civilian Conservation Corps, where you get 3 square meals a day, and there is a medical officer on duty for each company. That was actually one role that was given to African Americans, one of the more administrative type roles that African Americans held in segregated companies, and not really attaining the, you know, the commanding officer role, but medical officers that were African Americans. And as far as I'm aware, healthcare was good. I didn't see a lot of enrollees complaining about healthcare. Certainly complaining about the labor and the heat and in the cold, but not about the healthcare that they received if they needed it.
Okay, wonderful. I think we could have time for one more question if anyone thinks of anything.
I'll take that as a no, George.
Yep, it seems like it. Well, oh, did Professor McCammack and I cross paths at Lake Forest College? I regret to say no, we did not, unfortunately. I took classes.
The biggest mistake of George's life, not taking a class with me.
The biggest mistake. I did take classes with Glenn Adelson, though, who was involved with environmental studies. Okay, so with that, thank you to everybody for attending tonight's program. Brian, thank you immensely for such an insightful look into your work and your research. And it was a fantastic program that both combined the African-American ideals and values that we're striving to bring to the surface with our deeply rooted and rising high programming. But also, if anyone's familiar with the workings on of the History Center at the current moment, we're involved with a lot of upcoming programming and announcements, social events that have to do with our garden initiative. That will be a long-term investment in the History Center to build out and construct a number of learning gardens, educational gardens around the History Center campus. So this seemed like the perfect program to kind of coincide between those two themes. So again, Brian, thank you immensely. I'll put it in the chat once again, a link to Brian's book, Landscapes of Hope, available at Harvard University Press. We've also have links to both local environmental organizations centered around Chicagoland. We have Clean Power Lake County and the Sweetwater Foundation. So if you're interested in supporting local environmental organizations, please go check those two out. And then I also have a link to our History Center Lake Forest Lake Bluff main website if you're looking for future information on upcoming programs and tours. And then we also have a link to the wonderful people over at Lake Forest Open Lands for co-sponsoring this event. This program was also reported, so I know we'll have a lot of viewership on YouTube as well. So thank you all for watching there. And with that, I'd like to say good night to everybody. Thank you again for attending, and we'll see you next time at the History Center.